Chapter 11 deals with unit testing, and we are going to learn how to unit test our functions and the methods that are in our classes. And we'll specifically focus on input and output. A lot of languages utilize unit testing, and a couple terms that you should be familiar with are unit test and test case. Unit test is used to verify one aspect of a module's behavior to verify that it is correct. A test case includes all input a module is expected to receive and the output it is expected to produce. So first, we are going to take a look at how to set up a unit test for functions. And then we're going to take a look at how to set up unit testing for class methods. And the procedures are fairly similar in both. In Python, there is a unit test class that is specifically for unit testing, and we have to import that. And so at the top of our test program, we're going to say import unit test. And then we also need to import the, in this case, function that we want to test. So we're going to use from whatever file it's in, import, and whatever the name of the function is. So an example from the book is we are importing from the name function file, and we're going to specifically import the get formatted name function. So the first two lines in the program, import unit test and import the function that we're going to test. The next line creates a new test class, and we are inheriting from unit test.test case. For your new test class, it is standard practice to put the word test somewhere in the name. So example would be class names test case, which is inheriting from unit test.test case. So at this point, we've got importing unit test, we're importing our function, and we have created a new class that inherits from unit test.test case. So our next step is to create a method that tests the function. The test class that you create can test one function, or you could do multiple functions. In the test method that you create, you do need to call the function that you're testing, and you need to pass it the data that it needs for processing. And after it returns from processing, it'll return a value, and that value is what you're going to want to check to see if it is what you expect it to be. Okay, and if the value that it returns is what you expect, then it should pass the unit test. To check the values that are returned from functions, we use assert methods. There are several different methods available, and this table lists some of the more popular ones. Probably the one that you're going to use most often is assert equal, where you're checking the value that's returned from the function to see if it is equal to a specific result that you're expecting. But you can see that you can also test for not equal, true or false. You can check to see if you have an item that is contained in a list or maybe an item that's not in a list. You can check for an instance or not an instance. So you have all sorts of different assert methods available. And if you wanted to see additional assert methods, I do have a link to unit test here. Now, since we want to check to make sure the return value is formatted correctly, we're going to use assert equal. And we are going to be checking to see if the value returned is what we expect it to be. So in our little example, we're giving the test method a name. And it is important that you begin it with test underscore, because any method in your unit testing program that begins with test underscore will automatically run. So we're calling this thing test underscore first last name. And then we are calling get formatted name. This is the function that we want to test. And we are passing it a lowercase first name and a lowercase last name. It then goes to the function because we imported the function. So it's going through the actual function, formatting first and last name, and it is returning it. And the return value is stored in formatted name. Now, to check to make sure that the function worked, we're using assert equal. And we are calling it with self, which is our current test object. We're calling it with self, and we're passing it that formatted name that got returned, and we're passing it the correctly formatted first and last name so it can check to see if they are equivalent. Okay, so that is our unit test. And you can see the syntax up here. You call your function, you pass it the arguments that it needs, you store the return value, and then you use self.assert equal to compare the return value to what you expect. Now, how do we get this thing to run? At the very bottom of the program, if the program that you're currently in is the main program, if that they're equivalent, in our case they are, then it calls unit test main, which starts the program and runs everything. So when it returns, what you're going to see, and I'll show you this down here, for every test method, if the method works, you're going to see a dot. So in our case, this is the whole test program. There's just not a lot here. So we're only doing one test method. So we have one dot. And here it's telling you, yep, we ran one test. And on my system, it took 0 seconds. And it came back with OK, which means it worked. Other outcomes would be fail or error. Now, what happens if you run multiple tests and some of them work and some of them don't? Well, you will see a dot for every one that worked. If it fails, you're going to see an F. So if you ran 4 tests and one of them failed, you could see ... F . Okay? And then instead of seeing OK, at the bottom, it will tell you how many failed. So Here is another example because I wanted to show you what it looks like when it fails. So I've got that same test underscore first last name method that we just looked at. And then I have a second one that I created with that I put V2 on the end. So I've got a unique method name. And I'm calling the function, sending it the same first and last name. But in the assert equal method, I'm now passing it a lowercase first and last name. So formatted name is coming back with a capital letter for first and a capital letter for last name, and I'm having it check against all lowercase. So they are not going to be equal. So this should fail. And when I ran it, you can see the first test was successful and the second one did fail, and it has an F. And then the output is actually pretty useful if a test fails because it's actually showing you that you have an assertion error. And that means that the assert method that you used came back with a fail. And here it's showing me what the problem is. It is saying that the one that was formatted is not equal to the one that I sent. And you can actually see it right there. And then you can see it ran 2 tests and one was a failure. And so that is actually pretty useful output. Once you set up your unit tests, if you change the logic in the function, but you do not change the input or the output, you can run the unit test as is. However, if you change either the input or the output, you may end up having to modify the unit test. So for example, if I change get formatted name and I add middle name, okay, and if I make it required, my unit test is not going to work, okay, because I am passing it only the first and the last name. I'm not passing it middle name. So if I was going to change my function like this and run the unit test, it would fail. However, if I don't want to change the unit test, I could make middle name optional by setting a default value. And if I set a default value, then unit test can still run successfully. However, it's always a good idea to test all of your input parameters. So if I make this change and I make middle name optional, then down here in my unit test, I'll keep the first test as is because middle name is optional. I still want to test to make sure the first and the last name are formatted correctly if there is no middle name. But now my second test I am going to change and I'm going to pass it first name, last name, and middle name. And then I'm going to check to make sure that is formatted correctly. Okay, so testing functions is pretty straightforward. Okay, and this hands-on is going to have you practice that. And there's a separate video for the hands-on, so we are moving on to unit testing classes. So unit testing classes is not quite as straightforward. It is similar because we are still importing unit test. And we still do need to import the class that we're going to test methods from. What makes it a little bit more complicated is that we actually have to create a test object using the constructor from the class we are testing. So we're going to walk through a couple examples so you can see how this needs to be set up. So first we're going to look at an example from the book, and then we're going to look at an additional example. The one from the book is actually pretty simple because in the constructor, it's only receiving one parameter. Okay, question. That's the only thing that you need to send it when you create a class object. Okay, so you can see that it takes question, it's assigning it to self question, then it's got a response list that is empty, and then it's got a couple different methods. There's one that will show the question, and then there's one that actually adds responses to the response list. And then there's another one that kind of iterates through that response list and shows you what the responses are. Okay, so that is the entire class. And here is a program that's using the class just so you can see how it might be used in a program. And we are going to unit test anonymous survey. So to set this up, we do need to do an import of unit test, and we also have to import the anonymous survey class. Okay, and then we have to create our test class that is inheriting from unit test.test case. Okay, that is the same as what we had to do basically up in functions. Okay. What's different is that in a unit test for a class, the very first method has to be setup. And what this method does is it is going to create an object using the constructor of the class we are testing. What's also unique about setup method is that it will run before every unit test that we have in our file. So it basically runs and resets the values. So that is something that you need to keep in mind when you are setting up the test data. So for the anonymous class, what we've got here is we're setting the question, which is the only parameter that it requires. And then here we are creating the object. So it's calling the constructor, passing it question, and this is where we are storing it. Self.mySurvey. So when we call anonymous survey methods, we have to use self.mySurvey to call them. We are also setting up a list of correct responses here. Okay, and these are test responses. Now, it's helpful to look at the original methods when we're going through and creating these test methods. Because the test methods, remember, have to call those original methods that you are testing. Okay, so the store responses method in the anonymous survey class is the method that we want to test. And we want to make sure that it stores the first response correctly, or one response. And we also want to make sure that if we add a whole list of responses, that it stores everything in the list correctly as well. So we are going to create two test methods for store response. Our first test method, we are going to use self.mySurvey. We're going to use that object to call the store response method. This is the method that we are calling. It is passing the first response stored up here in self responses. So it is passing English. So it it passes English to store response, and you can see what it does. It adds it to responses. So in our assert method, what we want to see is if English self.response 0 is in the property responses from our object, our test object. So we've got self.mySurvey, which is the test object, dot responses. So what we're expecting there is for both of them to be English, okay? Because we sent English here, it went through, and it should have stored English. So what it's storing here, we are accessing using self.mysurvey.responses. Okay, these are connected. That is what we're testing. If they are equal, awesome. It's going to come back successful. And if they aren't, that indicates we have a problem in our store response method. Our second test. So it goes through the first test. This is important to understand. And then it goes through setup and it resets the values. Okay. And so when I mean reset the values, it calls anonymous survey, sends it the question, and responses is basically set to nothing again. Okay. And so then it's going to come through this second test method. And you can see that we've got a little slightly different name than the first one. And the first thing that it does is we have a for in loop, and it's going through our list of responses that we created up here. Okay, and it's taking each response and sending it through store responses, which adds it to the response list. So we're calling it with self.mySurvey. Okay, store response is the method we're calling, and we're passing it each response. Okay, so what that should do is fill up the list with English, Spanish, Mandarin. Okay, then we have another for in loop where we are going to double check to make sure each of these, English, Spanish, and Mandarin, is in that response list that store response was supposed to create. Okay, so we have 4 response in self responses, so it's going to go through this list. Self.assert in, it's checking each one. So first it checks English to see if self.mySurvey responses, so this is the response list that is created in the class, if English is in that list. Okay, and then it looks to see if Spanish is in the list, and then it looks to see if Mandarin is in the list. If all of them are in the list, awesome, it passed. If they aren't all in the list, then we are going to get a fail. Okay, so that is kind of in a nutshell how testing works for a simple class. And I think of it as a simple class because there's only one parameter. So here is another example. And this is similar to what you're going to be doing in the exercise. And for this one, we are going to be unit testing a store class. And the store class has 3 parameters. 2 are required, 1 has a default. Okay, so we have store name, store type, and daily sales. Now, there's really no need to test printfs. Okay, what you really need to test are equations. Those are the things that could end up being wrong. So what we are going to test is setting daily sales and incrementing daily sales, those 2 things. And you will notice that we convert whatever gets sent to us into float. So we want to make sure that if sales comes in and it's a string, that it gets converted. If it's an integer, it gets converted. If it's float, it's good. We want to make sure those things work. So step by step, how we would go about setting up our test store file. We start by importing unit test, and we also are importing our store class. Okay, then we are inheriting from unit test.test case, and I'm calling it test store. Okay, so all of that is step 1. Step 2, create the setup method. So the class that we're testing is expecting 3 parameters, and even though one of them is optional, I am going to send data for all 3 because I do want to make sure that they all work. So I've got a store name, a store type, and daily sales. You can see I've created variables for those. Here is where I'm calling the class constructor. I'm sending it the data. And self.store is my test object that I'm going to be using to call methods that are in the store class. So the first test method I'm going to create is for set daily sales, and I'm going to pass it a number. And I decide to send it an integer. Self.store is the object I need to use to call set daily sales. So you'll see I've given it a name, and you always want to prefix with test underscore so that it automatically runs. And so I said set daily sales integer. So I know that this is the one passing the integer. And I have a sales variable that I assign a fairly large number to. And then I use the self.store object to call set daily sales, passing it my sales figure. So what I would expect then, because this particular method changes the daily sales. So I would expect that self.store.daily sales, okay, which is the property that is in my object, I would expect that it would equal this very large number that I set it to. And if it does, awesome, the test worked. Then I do a second test, and this time I'm sending it a string because I want to make sure that not only can it handle numbers, but it can also handle a string. So I'm sending it a string, and then everything else is kind of the same. Because I'm still using self.store. I'm using that object to call set daily sales. I'm still passing it the sales variable, and I'm still checking daily sales to make sure that it is whatever that number is, that 100,000 figure. Now you may think, well, if it's converting it to float, why isn't there a decimal? And that is because there are no decimal places in the number, so it's omitting trailing decimals. My next test. This one is for increment daily sales, and I'm going to pass it a float value. So I've got my test here. And remember, before each one of these tests, it goes through setup. So right before it goes through increment daily sales, it's a resetting daily sales to 15,000. So here I've got the sales at $200.50, and I am calling increment daily sales, and I'm sending it that figure. So when it comes back, what I want to test is to see if the daily sales that were calculated in my class are equal to $15,200.50, because that is what I would expect, okay? Because the value gets reset, you add $200.50 to it. This is what it should be. Okay, and then I go ahead and test that same method using a string. So in this case, I'm sending it 100. So before this test, it's going through setup again. So daily sales is reset to 15,000. Okay, so we're passing the $100 sales as a string, and then we're checking to see if what it calculated is equal to 15,100, which is what we expect it to be, okay, if the string is converted into a float properly. Okay, then finally, at the bottom of the program, we have if name is equal to main, which means the program you're in is your main program, then it's going to go ahead and run the unit test. So here is the entire unit test. And you can see I've got 4 different tests. And here's my output. You can see I have 4 dots. It ran 4 tests, and everything was okay.